Hello again. I thought I'd try something a little different for a change. As I'm sure that I've mentioned before, I used to write a lot for True Detective magazine in the 1980s and 90s. And since I hear that true crime podcasts are hugely popular, I thought that I might have a crack at that game. This is the story of the oldest man hanged in Britain in the 20th century, and possibly the oldest man ever executed in this country. There are fads and fashions in murder just as there are in other fields of human endeavour, such as architecture and music. Today, the commonest means used in this country to cut short the life of another person is stabbing with a sharp implement. Around 40% of British homicides are carried out in this way. A century ago, rather than jabbing with something pointed, taste ran more to slashing and hacking, invariably at the throat or neck of the prospective victim. A third of the murderers hanged in the early part of the 20th century committed their crimes by using this method. The weapon wielded was, in almost every such case, an open razor. Not for nothing was the open or straight razor known colloquially as the throat razor. Murder is usually a spur-of-the-moment act, being committed with whatever weapon lays closest at hand. In America, where privately owned firearms are alarmingly common, two-thirds of homicides involve the use of guns. In Britain, 100 years ago, the most deadly instrument readily available in the average home was the razor. For centuries, men in this country shaved using single-edged blades, which, when not in use, folded neatly into a handle. These razors looked a little like blunt-ended knives. Such open blades can be hazardous, but it wasn't until American inventor King Camp Gillette patented his safety razor in December 1901 that men wishing to be clean-shaven had any choice in the matter. The first safety razors appeared in Britain in 1905, but they were slow to catch on, and when World War One started in 1914, most men in this country still relied upon the straight razor. Once upon a time, Leytonstone was a pretty little village in Essex. It was, in the course of time, though, overwhelmed by the inexorable growth of the capital, and it's now an unremarkable and singularly unattractive district in East London. The suburb's only claim to fame is that one or two famous people were born or grew up here. Film director Alfred Hitchcock and, more recently, footballer David Beckham being the most well-known of these. Just over a century ago, Leytonstone enjoyed brief notoriety as the scene of a brutal murder which took place there. This killing was essentially a commonplace domestic crime. There were, however, several points of the case which caused it to stand out, not least of which was that the murderer became the oldest person to be hanged in 20th century Britain. In August 1914, Charles Frembd, and that's a very odd name, it's spelled Frembd, and his wife Louisa were living together at 44 Harrow Road in Leytonstone. The unusual surname is accounted for by the fact that Frembd was of German origin, not a particularly good thing to be in England at that time, the very month that England had declared war on Germany. Although he had been born in Germany, Charles Frembd had not lived there since he was a teenager. At various times he had lived in the United States and different parts of England, before settling down to run a grocer's shop on the ground floor of his home in Harrow Road. Until the previous year, Frembd had been a widower, but while staying at the seaside resort of Yarmouth, he met a widow who took his fancy. Despite being in his late 60s, there was a whirlwind courtship, and marriage followed in the spring of 1913. From the beginning, it was possible that Charles Frembd realized that he had made a terrible mistake in remarrying. There were constant arguments, and it seemed that his wife was often nagging him in front of witnesses. None of which can, of course, excuse, although it may go some way towards explaining, his actions on the night of Thursday, the 27th of August, 1914. Charles and Louisa Frembd shared their home with a domestic servant by the name of Dorothy Woolmore, who had lived with them since October 1913. On the night of the 27th of August, she went to bed at 11 o'clock at night, leaving the Frembds sitting downstairs. 20 minutes after retiring, she heard Mrs. Frembd going to bed, and then at about 10 to midnight, her husband. According to the evidence which she subsequently gave at Charles Frembd's trial for murder, Dorothy Woolmore heard no sounds at all during the night. It was Louisa Frembd's habit to wake her servant at 7:30 in the morning each day. On the morning of the 28th of August, Dorothy Woolmore woke up at 8:20 and realised that she must have overslept. Worried that she would get into trouble, she dressed hurriedly and went downstairs to start cleaning. Finding that her mistress was not up either, the girl, thinking that Mrs. Frembd might be ill, went back upstairs and knocked on the bedroom door, but there was no answer. Dorothy carried on with her work, but when there was still no sign of either of the Frembds after another half hour, she went upstairs and knocked again on the bedroom door. This time, when there was no reply, she pushed open the door. A scene of utter horror greeted her. Both Charles and Louisa Frembd were in bed, laying side by side. The two of them were drenched in blood. Charles Frembd had cut his wife's throat before making an ineffectual attempt to end his own life in the same way. The shocked servant ran to the local police station. The police found that although Louisa Frembd was dead, her husband had suffered only superficial cuts from his suicide bid. They found a note written by the man whom they strongly suspected of murdering his wife. It said, "Her first husband made off with himself, and I cannot stand it any longer." They also recovered the open razor which had been used to kill Louisa Frembd. As soon as Charles Frembd was well enough to be discharged from hospital, he was arrested and charged with both the murder of his wife and also with attempting to commit suicide. This was done as a precaution. In the event that Frembd was acquitted of the murder charge, the police wished to ensure that they had something they could get him on. It's sometimes forgotten that attempting suicide was a criminal offence in this country until 1961. Charles Frembd's defence was neither original nor convincing. He claimed to have no memory at all of the events leading up to his wife's death, and was unable, therefore, to offer any explanation of what might have occurred. He did go so far as to say that his wife's nagging had driven him to distraction. Counsel for Frembd found that the task of defending his client was sabotaged by Charles Frembd himself. The defence was originally to be one of insanity. Sidney Dyer, the medical officer at Brixton Prison, agreed that Frembd, who was 71, had signs of senile decay, what we would today call dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Frembd, though, refused point-blank to accept this and insisted on asserting that he was fit to plead and stand trial. It proved impossible to talk the old man out of this disastrous course of action. The trial was held on October the 15th, 1914, before Mr. Justice Rowlett at London Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. It was little more than a formality. There was no real doubt that it had been Charles Frembd who cut his wife's throat. The jury did, however, add a rider to their verdict of guilty, recommending mercy for Frembd on account of his age and apparent infirmity. Nobody really expected a man of that age to be hanged. Unfortunately, two factors militated against Charles Frembd having his sentence commuted to imprisonment. The first of these was the utterly ruthless nature of his crime. This had not been a death resulting from a violent struggle, but the killing of a defenceless woman as she lay in her bed. The second point working against Frembd was, of course, the fact that he was German. Anti-German sentiments were beginning to catch hold in Britain, and the having of an obviously foreign name, combined with the misfortune to have been born in Germany, probably didn't help his chances of evading the gallows. That some anti-German prejudice was at work may be seen from the newspaper coverage of the case. The Times, for instance, reported that the Home Secretary was not going to grant a reprieve for Frembd under the headline, "No Reprieve for the German Murderer." The execution of Charles Frembd was notable for another reason, apart from his being the oldest person to be executed in 20th century Britain. Because Leytonstone was at that time in Essex, Frembd was held under sentence of death in Springfield Prison in Chelmsford, it being the invariable practice at that time to execute murderers in the county in which they had committed their murder. His was to be the last execution ever carried out in Essex, because the jail was, a few weeks later, handed over to the military for the duration of the war. The gallows were dismantled and never again erected. Charles Frembd was hanged on the 4th of November, the executioner being John Ellis, who carried out all but 8 of the 40 executions by hanging which took place in this country during the early part of the century. Ironically, in view of the number of men he hanged who had wielded open razors as their weapon of choice with which to commit murder, Ellis later died after cutting his own throat with a razor, following his retirement as chief hangman. John Ellis decided to give the condemned man a drop of 6 feet and 6 inches. There were not infrequently disagreements between the executioner and the prison authorities over the length of the drop which should be given during an execution. Briefly stated, hanging a person involves a very fine calculation which ideally snaps the neck cleanly. Too little and the victim might choke to death. Too long a drop and the head might be entirely detached from the body. Charles Frembd's execution was marred by an unfortunate incident. When Ellis had seen him the day before the execution, he had noticed that Frembd looked unwell. His throat was still surgically plastered from his suicide attempt, and this worried the executioner. Hanging men with injuries to their throat was apt to be a messy business, and more than one condemned man had been reprieved on those grounds alone, that hanging him might reopen the wound with all the gory consequences. As it happened, the mishap which occurred during the execution had nothing at all to do with Frembd's injuries. The grim procession of prison governor, chaplain, warders, executioner, and condemned man moved to the gallows on the morning of November the 4th without incident, the old man appearing to be dazed and scarcely aware of what was going on. Once on the trapdoor, Ellis swiftly pulled the white cotton hood over the doomed man's head and secured the noose around his neck. The executioner then moved to the lever which operated the trapdoors. As he turned, Frembd fainted and began falling to one side. This meant that as the trap opened, he didn't drop vertically down, but fell to one side. At the inquest, it was noticed that the dead man's face had a number of injuries, including a black eye. These had been caused by his hitting the trapdoors as he plummeted through them.